PLC presents, brought to you by the donations of our faithful partners.
Well, shalom and welcome back to the house, the family, and the piece of land. When we left off last, we're once again taking some of these very familiar words and taking them back to that simple little picture that we still have on the board back here of what they meant when they first started, so we can understand them when they end up in our abstract world, which is a world that we all live in. We were last talking about the statement that Paul makes in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, when he says, "For by grace are you saved through faith." And we're analyzing those words. We talked about grace, the idea of supporting something or pitching a tent with someone. And then we were in the middle of the word faith when we were talking about, when we use an example, literally, where it's translated that way in Isaiah, of literally driving a nail in a sure place. To make something sure or secure, that is the concept of the pictographic concept of faith. Now, another example here is in Numbers chapter 11, verse 7. Numbers 11, verse 7 is Bamidbar in Hebrew. It says, "Have I conceived all these people," or all this people? "Have I begotten them?" This is Moses talking. "That you should say unto me, carry them in your bosom as a nursing father, bearing the suckling child unto the land which thou swearest unto their fathers." Now, that word nursing father there in the Hebrew, nursing father, is our word aman. Now, so you might ask yourself, well, how does a man nurse a child? Okay. Well, the point is that he is, the word that's being used here is the Hebrew word for faith or trust, and it's translated as a nursing father. Their support comes from him, if you will. That's what he's kind of complaining about here. Because a nursing father is a contradiction of terms. Obviously, that's something that a woman does. But the background of the word is to support something. Another example of support we can find in the book of Ruth, chapter 4, verse 6. On your screen, you can see Ruth 4:16, when it says, "And Naomi took the child and laid it in her bosom and became nurse unto it." Naomi took the child, laid it in her bosom, and became a nurse unto it. Now, let's go back and get the context of that a little bit. If you're familiar with the book of Ruth, Ruth is a Moabitess, of course, and a Moabitess is not of Israel. But she becomes the lineage, part of the lineage of the Messiah, if you will, of Judah, and counted in with that lineage when we get to the New Testament. Why? Because she believed. That's the way it's been from the very beginning. It's always been by your trust and faith of the God of Israel. And so from the very beginning, we've talked about this many times before, from day one, if you will, it has never mattered whether you were Jew or Gentile in the body of Messiah. Because the body of the Messiah, according to John 1:1 and 1:14, is in the beginning. Because the Messiah is in the beginning. You don't just have a head in the beginning. The Messiah has a body. And that body are us. And so as you read the stories, as you go through the Torah, as you read through the first 5 books, as you go into the prophets, as you go into the writings, right into the New Testament, you'll see the consistent pattern, and it never fails from beginning to end. And that is, if you are of the physical loins of Abraham, and you believe, you're of Israel. If you are not of the physical loins of Abraham, in other words, you are a stranger or a sojourner, but you believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then you are one with the homeborn, Exodus chapter 12, verses 48 and 49. You are one with the homeborn. One Torah for both. It's always been a matter whether you're a stranger or of the homeborn. If you believe, you're in the body of the Messiah. Why? Because there's only one good seed from the very beginning. And a seed produces a body. There's only one body of Messiah. Paul desperately tried to tell us in the book of Ephesians, there's only one. And his teaching backs that up from beginning to end. Of the concept of the seed, the principle of the seed, which is one of the foundations of my ministry as well. Paul, outside of Moses, who started the whole thing, because Moses, the writer, the father's the author, the writer of the first 5 books. Outside of Moses, Paul mentions and talks about the seed more than any one individual in all of Scripture. Moses is the only one that talks about it more because Moses is the one who gives us the book of Genesis as the writer and the compiler of this book. And so he introduces the whole concept of a seed and continues that seed when he describes Abraham's seed and in Isaac you shall be called and all those things. And so he talks about it more than anybody else. Paul is the other one that talks about it more than anybody else except for Moses. So if you don't understand the simple principle of a seed from the very beginning, you're going to misconstrue everything that Paul says. Everything, particularly in the book of Romans and the book of Galatians, where he talks about the seed. If you don't understand that simple principle from the very beginning, you will think that Paul was condemning the Torah, if you didn't understand these simple little principles. And so we go back to Ruth. Ruth is another example where your God will be my God and your people will be my people. How? By faith. She chose to follow the God that was Naomi's God, her mother-in-law. And you all know the story. And then she ends up marrying Boaz. And Boaz and Ruth have a child. There's a result of their consummation, okay, of their marriage. They have a child, and it says in Ruth chapter 4 verse 16 that they took that child and laid it in her, or Naomi took the child and laid it in her bosom and became a nurse unto it. So who's the one who's going to nurse the child? In other words, who's the one that's going to give the child all of its sustenance and everything it needs to grow up strong? Notice it comes from Naomi, if you will, the Jew. It comes from that. That's where the sustenance is going to come from. See, that's why you and I, as the wild olive branch, when we believe in the Messiah, we are grafted into the natural tree where we take all our sustenance and nutrition and that which causes us to grow and produce fruit. And there's only one good seed, so it's always going to produce the same fruit. That's the same picture that you see from beginning to end. To be grafted in and protect. So this picture of Ruth is the same thing. That Naomi is the one that's going to nurse the child and cause it to grow up and produce fruit. And that word nurse in English is the Hebrew word for faith. In Hebrew, aman is the root of that. Now you wouldn't in English, if you didn't see this in Hebrew, you may not make the connection between nursing a child and faith. You may not see Moses being a nursing father and faith. So the picture of grace and faith that Paul is drawing you in Ephesians chapter 2, 8 and verses 8 and 9 is a picture of someone pitching a tent and it's made secure by faith, your faith. And this is all a gift from God. So God comes to earth and He pitches the tent with you. And when you get to that tent, you secure that tent. Meaning that it's that tent you're going to stay in. And you're not going to wander around from tent to tent and so on and so forth. You're securing that tent. And so when the Bible says, just believe, it's the picture that it's drawing you is that you have chosen by an act of your own will to come into our Father's tent. And all those who are under the tent are under the one Father. Same rules for no matter who comes into the tent. Because there's only one good tent. That's why the Bible starts out with a bet. We've talked about that before. The very first letter of Revelation to man in our written scripture, in our written Hebrew, is a bet, which is the letter of the house, because God begins with a house and He's going to end with one house. Begins with one house, ends with one house. What happened in between? That house got divided. And what happens to a house that's divided, or even a kingdom that's divided? It shall not stand. So all the writings of all the prophets and the writings from that point forward is all about the reuniting of the house of Israel with the house of Judah into one house with one shepherd, one flock with one shepherd. And this has always been done by faith from the very beginning. Okay, so that's the beautiful picture of grace and faith. Let's move on to another word here. In Psalm chapter 23, verse 3. Now, we've talked about this very briefly as well in one of the past shows, but I'm going to do it in more detail this time. Psalm 23, verse 3 says, He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. He restores my soul. Now notice the association of restoration with leading me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Now that word paths there in English is a very linear term. Path is a linear thought process. There's lots of good Hebrew words that mean a straight path to go down. Derek and Oric and Nativ and words like that. But this is not one of them here. This is the word that we've discussed before. This word translated as paths is agol in the Hebrew. Agol. That is an ayin, a gimel, and a lamed. Ayin, gimel, lamed. Now that word means to make a cycle. We've talked about this before. To make a cycle. You'll notice in Hebrew that many words, or all the words in Hebrew that have a G and an L in them, have something to do with something starting out and returning right back where it came from, or something that's rolled over. Now let's talk about this word for a minute. And once again, it is a ayin, a gimel, and a lamed. Now there it is on your screen. The three letters, the ayin, the gimel, and the lamed, are gol. You start from the right and you go to the left. It means to make a cycle, a circle to go around, and it's also translated, we're going to talk about this in a few minutes, as a bull or a calf. We're going to talk about the meaning of that in just a few minutes. Agol is primarily based on the gimel and the lamed. The gimel and the lamed is the picture of the foot, or that which walks, and the lamed is the letter of something that leads. Something that leads. And so in Hebrew it ends up being something that leads in a path. Now, the word agol not only means to make a cycle, but the nuance of the word means not only to make a cycle, but to make a little rut in the ground when you make that cycle. As a matter of fact, I would like to go to the board. Let's go to the board for just a minute. This is the concept. Now, I'm drawing something everybody's familiar with, a cycle. All right? And agol not only means to make a cycle, but it means to do it so often that you wear a little rut in the ground. You wear a little trench or a track in the ground. You do it so often. And God has designed it. His paths, His way. So what He's saying there in Psalm chapter 23 verse 3 is that He's saying, lead me in your cycles of righteousness. Not a straight path. That's linear thinking. God teaches in cyclical patterns. And so He's saying to make a cycle. Cycles of righteousness. He's saying, I put my righteousness in this cycle. And so when you continue to do the things that I have commanded you to do from the very beginning, you will do it so often and so consistently that you will actually wear a little rut in the ground. And when you do it by nature now. It's difficult to veer off the path because you've done it so often, it becomes part of you, it becomes part of your life. And so you do it naturally from that point forward. Now, one might ask, what in the world does the bull and the calf have to do with making this cycle? Well, let me take you back to that. Thousands of years ago, the picture is they would have this threshing wheel, this threshing instrument. And it was a wheel. Same kind of wheel that you would see in Ezekiel's wheel. They'd have a threshing instrument. And what they would do is they would take a calf or a bull and they would yoke it to that threshing wheel. Several of them, as a matter of fact. And they would use the calves to push the wheel around to do the threshing, to do their work for it. So these calves would push this yoke around in a circle like this, in a cycle. And those things would do it, those animals would do it so often that the animals would actually wear a little path in the ground, a little ditch or a little rut, sometimes we call it, in the ground. And they would do it so often that it got to the point where they did not have to tie the calf to the wheel anymore. The calf would actually go right to the wheel and push it. They didn't have to yoke. Remember, Yeshua says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. If you do it the Father's way, it's not a burden, and so forth. And so they would do it naturally after a while. Now, what's interesting about that is that in the Exodus, because I'm going to submit to you that the enemy teaches us his cycles. He gets us all involved in his ways through his cycles. Even though I believe that the bad guy wants us to think in a linear point of view because that's evolutionary thinking. Linear thinking is evolutionary thinking. The reality is things operate in cycles whether he likes it or not. Things always operate in cycles. God's cycles, God's feast or His cycles are the 7 feasts. His 7 feasts that He gave us in the beginning happen 7 times in the year, always consistently. When the barley starts coming up out of the ground in the spring, that's going to start, and the new moon is going to start the festivals and so forth, and in the appointed times. And so those consistently operate in cycles every year. This is God's cycles. Now man has his own, and that's the problem with the Exodus. But God has His cycle. So every month, He has a cycle called the new moon. Rosh Chodesh is a monthly cycle. The weekly cycle, Shabbat. Every week consistently, Shabbat comes around. The Sabbath comes around. That's His cycles. Every day, the sun comes up over the horizon and goes down in the next horizon. Consistently in cycles. Ladies, you have a monthly cycle. Your monthly cycle is a beautiful picture always of the death, burial, and resurrection of the Messiah. Believe it or not, God has placed that picture even in the monthly cycles. There are cycles. I submit to you that God's way, His words, are displayed in the creation once again. And that's why I know His words are taught that way. His Torah is taught that way because that which the Torah created is also operating that way. Everything is operating in cycles. Outside my door. As a matter of fact, I remember talking to my wife just a little while ago. I went over just a couple months ago and I was grabbing some buds on a tree. And I remember grabbing those buds and saying to my wife, you know something I noticed, honey? I noticed that about a year ago, those buds were also blooming on that tree. And then I looked up into the sky and I saw a full moon up in the sky and I said, honey, you know, it seems to me about 30 days ago, that moon was also full about 30 days ago. And I said, you know, the sun came up this morning. You know, yesterday about the same time the sun came up. There seems to be some cycles going on out there. Not this linear thinking. If Mr. Al Gore would figure this out, maybe we wouldn't have some of these, political things going on. If he understood the world as being a cycle, not a straight line. See, because he thinks from that perspective. And that's why he believes what he does. And so these cycles are also produced by this calf. See, the Father in the beginning already knew that that's what the calf does. So that's why the Hebrew word for, the Hebrew root for cycles is the Hebrew word for this calf. Now, picture the children of Israel coming up out of Egypt in Exodus chapter 12. And when they do, all those who had the blood on their door, whether they were homeborn believers or strangers at believers, okay, this is a picture of believers now. There was one Torah for both. And then when you read Exodus chapter 12, verses 48 through 50, 51, I couldn't be more than 9 verses off, okay? You'll notice that all of the children of Israel come up out of Egypt. And when they come up out of Egypt, it says that there was a mixed multitude that came up with them. And so when they get out into the wilderness, this mixed multitude, I'm going to suggest to you, talks them in to making a calf out in the wilderness. And that calf is going to represent, they do it specifically at a festival, at an appointed time. They make their own calf. They make their own cycles out in the wilderness. They establish their own way of worshiping that God. And it's called calf worship. Now that word there in Hebrew is egel. It's written like this. Egel, which is a calf. The whole picture of cycles is they establish their own ways of doing things. I remember years ago, I watched a movie, and I know none of you out there watch movies, but if you have some friends that watch movies, ask them. A couple decades ago, I remember watching a movie in which at the beginning of the movie, these people come into this camp and they kill all the people except the little kids. So they kill this little boy's parents. And they capture the little boy along with their little children and they put him on this, guess what, this threshing wheel, this wheel, and they yoked him to it and they had him push this wheel round and around and around. And the first scene, it's a little kid. You only see him from the neck down. And the next scene, he's a young man. And the next scene, he's a bigger man. And the last scene, it's Conan the Barbarian, Arnold Schwarzenegger. Remember, he's pushing this threshing wheel around in a circle. And he's not yoked to it. And you'll notice that underneath him, you can see this little trench on the ground. That's that beautiful picture in Hebrew of why in Hebrew the word for a calf is also the word for making a cycle. And these are beautiful pictures. I would also like, as a matter of fact, let me give you another example up on the screen here. When it says in Shemot chapter 32 verses 3 and 4, it says, and all the people broke off the golden earrings which were in their ears and brought them unto Aaron, and he received them at their hand, and he fashioned it with a graving tool, and after he made it a molten calf, and they said, these be your gods, O Israel, which brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Now these are the gods that brought them up out of the land of Egypt? Oh goodness, no. But this is a picture of them going out into the wilderness after they just received the commandments. After they just received the commandments, they go out into the wilderness and they're already doing their own thing. I mean, they just received the commandments of God, which gave them blessings and so forth. But remember, when they get down to the bottom of the mountain, because of the mixed multitude that comes out with them, when they get down to the bottom of the mountain, it's already chaos. It's already chaos down at the bottom of the mountain. So when they get out into the wilderness, once they get out there, then they talk them into making these calves. And so they establish their own calf worship, their own ways, their own cycles. But the Father said, my righteousness is in my cycles, not your cycles. And my cycles are given from the very beginning. This also happens to be this bull or this calf. According to Hosea chapter 8 verses 5 and 6. According to Hosea 5 and 6, this is also the symbol of Ephraim. The symbol of Ephraim, who's the entity that represents the house of Israel in the new covenant. The house of Israel is represented by the words house of Israel, Joseph, Samaria, and Ephraim. Those are all words that are used that represent the house of Israel, one of the only two entities in the new covenant. And it happens to be a calf that represents where the 10 tribes are scattered throughout the nations, mixing with the other nations, mixing with their ways, physically and spiritually mixing with their ways. And Ephraim is represented by a calf, according to Hosea chapter 5 and 6. Why? Because it was a picture of them going and mixing and establishing their own cycles of righteousness. But once again, God's way are established, God's cycles or righteousness is established in His cycles. Let me go to one more verse on your screen here. Well, I guess I don't have it on the screen there. There is no, I do. Let's go back to it. Okay, there it is. Yaakov, chapter 3, verse 6. Hey, we're all friends here. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. So is the tongue among our members, that it defiles the whole body and sets on fire the course of nature, and is set on fire of hell. Now we're going to talk about this for a few minutes, and we'll probably take it in to the next broadcast as well, because I want to talk about this for a few minutes, because this is a wonderful picture of the cycles and the fact that the Father knew, as he speaks through Yaakov here, or James, about these cycles, about how they would be corrupted by his own people. Because Yaakov chapter 3 starts out, as a matter of fact, let me read this. Let's turn for a moment to Yaakov, James chapter 3, verse 1. And let's see what it has to say. You all know the context of this because you've probably heard this used many times. In Yaakov chapter 3, here's the way it starts out. It says, my brothers, be not many masters, knowing that we shall receive the greater condemnation. Now it starts out by saying that we, those who are teachers, are going to receive a greater condemnation. Why? Well, because of the mere fact that we are teaching, we are spreading it to more people. Now, if we're remaining faithful to God's truth and God's ways, then we're spreading His truth and His ways to more people. But if we are made a decision based upon just what we pass down from one generation to the next in our great seminaries and so forth and educational institutions, if we're just passing down the same thing that was taught to us, we're going to infect a lot more people than the average person. So there's a greater condemnation for the teachers. I'm pointing to you out there. If you're a teacher, and I'm serious as I can be, if you're a teacher, do your homework. Because if you're not maintaining the cycles of God and teaching the same thing that was there from the very beginning, you are infecting much more people, and you will be held to a greater condemnation. I take those words very seriously. I want to stand before my Father in the end. I want to stand before a Creator and give an account to how I responded to His Word, not how I responded to my organization or my religious system or this guy or this person, but how I responded to His Word is what I'm going to be held accountable for. I'm going to be held accountable for every idle word that comes out of my mouth. I'm going to be held accountable for how I responded to His Word in the multitudinous ways that He has expressed it to us. I'm not going to stand before Him and be held accountable for what some other system taught me. I want to be held accountable to His Word. So these are very serious words that Yaakov says here, because as we go on to read them, and we'll continue this next time, as we go on to read them, he's going to say that this little bitty tongue in our mouth, and he's not really talking about the tongue. He's not talking about that. He's talking about the words that come off of your tongue. That little bitty tongue is like a rudder on a ship. That little bitty tongue is like a bit in a horse's mouth. The mighty things that a little bitty thing can do. And then he's going to finish it up by saying that tongue is capable of setting the course of nature on fire. I'm going to show you what that is in the Greek. We're going to take it back to what these cycles that began in the very beginning and show you that how teaching can destroy the cycles of God's righteousness. So in the meantime, cling to your roots, that your days may be long and that you will prosper in everything you set your hand to do. We'll see you next time. Shalom Aleichem. Shalom, this is Brad Scott with the Wild Branch Ministry, and I hope this series of programs you've been able to see that there's wonderful treasures in your biblical text to be found through this beautiful language that it was written in from Genesis to Revelation. I hope we can clearly see that the end is revealed right out of the beginning. And once again, there's nothing new in your New Testament, it's just true. And I hope we continue to learn these beautiful treasures as we go through these programs. If you want to contact us, there's a couple of ways to do it. You can write us at the Wild Branch Ministry or Brad Scott at P.O. Box 97, Vernal, Utah, 84078. Or you can email us at brad@wildbranch.org. Our website is www.wildbranch.org. It's a really simple website. In the meantime, cling to your roots that your days may be long and that you will prosper in everything you set your hand to do. Shalom Aleichem.
This program was produced by and for God's Learning Channel. If you enjoy this program, we need your support to keep this program on GLC. Please make your checks out to God's Learning Channel, P.O. Box 61,000, Midland, Texas 79711-1000. Please be sure to designate where your contribution is intended. It is very important to let GLC know which programs you enjoy and support.